If you looked at Theodore Weston from the outside, which most people did, you would see exactly what he had always intended for the world to see. A man in control. A man who had built something from almost nothing and turned it into more than most people could count. He had started with a single small logistics company in his early 30s. Just a desk and a phone and an idea that he refused to let go of. And over 4 decades, he had grown it into something that stretched across borders and employed thousands of people who would never once meet him in person but whose livelihoods depended on decisions he made quietly in rooms they would never enter. His name appeared in financial publications with the kind of regularity that meant he had stopped being news and started being landscape. Just part of the scenery of success that people looked at and accepted as permanent. He was 64 years old, and he had the bearing of a man who had never once doubted that he would end up exactly where he was, composed, measured, the same expression in every photograph, every interview, every public appearance, a kind of steady, unreadable calm that people who admired him called strength, and people who found him difficult called coldness, and people who worked closely with him called simply Theodore. Because after enough time around a person, you stop trying to categorize them and just accept them as they are. And Theodore Weston, as he was a man who kept everything important somewhere the world could not reach it. The estate had been his home for 22 years. He had bought it when the company crossed a threshold that made certain kinds of purchases feel appropriate rather than excessive. And he had renovated it slowly over time, not with the flashy urgency of someone trying to prove something, but with the patience of someone who intended to stay. It sat on a generous piece of land outside the city, far enough from everything to feel genuinely removed, but close enough that he could reach his offices when he needed to, which was most days, because work had always been the thing that made the most sense to him. The grounds were immaculate. Wide lawns, old trees, a garden along the east side that had been his wife's project originally, before she passed, and that the staff still maintained with the same care she had given it herself. The house itself was large and well-appointed, and had every comfort that money could arrange and still manage to feel, to anyone paying close attention, profoundly empty. Not unclean, not neglected, just empty in the way that spaces feel when the people who gave them life are no longer in them. He lived there alone. Had for years now. He had a small, trusted staff who managed the house and the grounds and who had all been with him long enough to understand without being told that their employer was a man who valued efficiency and privacy above almost everything else. They moved through the house quietly. They did their work thoroughly. They kept their observations to themselves. This was not a written rule. It did not need to be. It was simply the atmosphere of the place set by the man at the center of it, absorbed over time by everyone around him. He took his meals alone most evenings. He had stopped hosting dinners or gatherings of any kind some years back, and nobody on staff had ever raised the subject or questioned it. He worked late on most nights and slept in broken stretches that left him looking, in the early mornings, like a man carrying something heavy, even when his hands were empty. He drank his coffee black, and he took his mornings without conversation, and he moved through the rooms of that enormous house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made peace with a version of life that most people would have found unbearable. Or so it appeared. Because the thing about a man who has spent decades learning to show the world exactly what he wants it to see is that you start to believe the performance is the person. You start to forget that somewhere underneath all of that careful composure, there is an actual human being with actual wounds that do not care how much money surrounds them. Theodore Weston had a wound. He had been carrying it for 4 years, and he had carried it so quietly, so completely away from any public eye, that the people who wrote about him in financial columns and business profiles had no idea it existed. The people who sat across from him in boardrooms had no idea. Even some of the people closest to him in a professional sense, people who had known him for decades, had only the vaguest sense that something had shifted in him some years back and had chalked it up to age or fatigue or the natural withdrawal that sometimes comes to men who have achieved everything they set out to achieve and find themselves with nowhere new to aim. None of that was it. It was simpler and heavier and more human than any of those explanations. He had lost his daughter. She had been 27 years old, and she had been the kind of person that you do not fully understand. You need it in the world until she's no longer in it. She had her mother's warmth and her father's mind, and something entirely her own that could not be attributed to either of them. A particular kind of aliveness that made every room she entered feel different from how it had felt before she walked in. Theodore had not been a demonstrative father in the way that some fathers are. He had not been the kind of man who said everything he felt when he felt it. But she had known. He believed that with his whole heart that she had known, because she was perceptive in the way that people are when they pay genuine attention to the people they love. And she had always paid genuine attention to him, even when he gave her less to work with than she deserved. The illness had come fast. That was the part that still caught him off guard sometimes, even 4 years later. Not slowly, the way you could at least track and prepare for, but fast, in the way of things that do not ask permission and do not wait for you to be ready. One season she was healthy and present and laughing at something on the phone in the kitchen of his estate during a Sunday visit. And then there were doctors, and then there were more doctors, and then there were conversations that no parent should ever have to sit through. And then there was a morning that arrived and did not bring her with it. He had handled the immediate aftermath the way he handled everything, by moving, by making decisions, by organizing what needed to be organized and ensuring that everything that needed to happen happened correctly. People had said he was remarkable in those days, composed, strong. They had meant it as a compliment, and he had received it as one because he had not known yet what all of that composure was costing him or where. The bill would eventually come due. The bill came due alone, in the quiet, in the early mornings before the house woke up, when there was nothing to organize and no decision to make and no performance to maintain for anyone. That was when it found him. And over 4 years, it had not gotten smaller the way people promised grief would. It had simply gotten more familiar. Like a presence, he had learned to live alongside without ever learning to live without. He had done one thing in the months after her passing that he had told no one about and had never discussed with anyone. On the east side of the property, not far from the garden his wife had planted, he had arranged for a small private cemetery plot, quiet, simple, surrounded by an iron fence. That was more about privacy than any kind of barrier. Just a plot of ground with a white headstone that had her name on it and the 2 dates that sat closer together than any father should ever have to see. And every single morning, without exception, before the rest of the estate woke up and the day began its demands, Theodore Weston walked to that plot and sat with his daughter. Nobody on staff spoke about it openly. Nobody acknowledged it in his presence. It was the one part of his life that existed entirely outside the careful management of everything else. And he believed, in the way that a deeply private man believes the things he has never tested against another person's knowledge, that it was entirely his secret. He was wrong about that. But he would not find out how wrong for a little while yet. Loretta Sims had not planned on being a housekeeper for 9 years at anyone's estate. That was not the life she had drawn up for herself. When she was younger and the future still felt like something you could negotiate with. She had planned on more, the way most young women plan on more. Not out of arrogance, but out of the simple human belief that effort and intention would eventually add up to something that resembled the life you had imagined. But life had a way of presenting you with circumstances that did not check with you first before arriving, and Loretta had spent most of her adult years responding to circumstances rather than executing plans. A marriage that had looked solid from the outside and turned out to be anything but. A divorce that left her with 2 young sons, a rented apartment, and the particular kind of determination that comes to women when they realize that waiting for someone else to fix things is no longer an option. She had worked in 3 different households before the Weston estate, each one teaching her something different about the work and about people and about the invisible line between being inside someone's life and being part of it. She had learned to be useful without being intrusive. She had learned to see everything and comment on almost nothing. She had learned that the people who lived in the grandest houses were not always the ones with the most sordid lives, and that wealth had a way of amplifying whatever was already there. The good and the difficult, rather than replacing it with something easier. By the time she arrived at the Weston estate 9 years ago, referred through an agency that had described her to the household manager as exceptionally reliable and exceptionally discreet. She was 51 years old, and she had already developed a particular skill set that the work required at this level. She was thorough without being invasive. She was present without being visible. She managed her responsibilities with a quiet authority that the other staff recognized and respected without anyone ever having to formalize it. She was not the household manager by title, but in practice, in the daily running of things, she was the person everyone deferred to when something needed sorting, and there was no time for a chain of command. She had learned the estate the way you learn any place you spend enough time in, room by room, season by season. The way the morning light moved through the west-facing windows in summer and how different they looked in winter. The way certain doors needed to be handled differently depending on the humidity because the wood swelled and contracted with the seasons, and if you did not know that you would fight them unnecessarily. The way the kitchen settled at night with small sounds that had startled her in her first week and become as familiar as her own breathing by her second month. She had also learned its sole occupant with the same patient attention, though she was always careful about the distinction between learning a person and presuming to know them. Theodore Weston was not a man who invited familiarity. He was courteous to the staff in the way that a certain kind of man is courteous, consistently, and without warmth, acknowledging their presence and their work without ever crossing into the territory of personal exchange. He remembered names, which she had noted because not all employers of his status bothered. He did not micromanage the household, which she appreciated, having worked for people who treated the running of their homes like a military operation they needed to personally direct at every step. He set expectations clearly at the beginning and trusted that they would be met. And when they were, which they always were under her watch, he said nothing, which was his version of approval. She understood that. She had known enough quiet men to understand that silence from them was not the same as indifference. Over 9 years, she had built up a picture of him that was made entirely from the edges, from what he left unfinished and what he returned to repeatedly, from the rooms he used and the rooms he did not, from the way the house sounded different when he was in it versus when he was traveling, a difference she could feel before she had confirmed it logically, the way animals sense weather. She knew that he had not always been this solitary, that the estate had once had a different atmosphere, warmer and more populated, because she could see it in the way certain rooms had been arranged and never rearranged, as if whoever had set them up that way was expected to return, and nobody had wanted to presume otherwise. She knew that something had changed in him some years before she arrived, and something more had changed in the years since she had been there. She did not know the full story. The staff did not discuss the details of their employer's personal life. Not in this household, not with each other, and certainly not with anyone outside. But she knew grief when she was in the same building with it. She had lived with her own long enough to recognize its particular quality in a space, the way it made certain silences heavier than other silences, and certain rooms feel like they were holding their breath. That particular morning had started the same as all of her mornings at the estate. She rose early, earlier than required, because she had never been able to sleep past a certain point, regardless of what time she had gone to bed. And she moved through her morning routine in the small but comfortable room she occupied in the staff wing with the efficient quiet of long habit. She dressed. She made tea in the small kitchen that the staff used. She reviewed her list for the day, which she kept in a small notebook she had carried for years, its cover worn soft from use. The East Garden needed attention that week. There had been a stretch of weather that had left things looking more ragged than she liked, and she had been meaning to get to it for several days, but other priorities had intervened. That morning, she decided she would start early, before the rest of the staff arrived, get a head start on it while the air was still and cool and nobody needed anything from her. She gathered what she needed and went out through the side door that opened onto the east grounds. The sky still carrying the pale gray quality of very early morning, the sun not fully committed yet to the day. The garden ran along the east side of the property in a long, shaped bed that curved gently toward the iron fence at the far end. She had always found the garden to be one of the more peaceful parts of her mornings when she worked in it. Something about putting her hands into soil and bringing order to growing things that settled her in a way that indoor work, satisfying as it was, did not quite manage. She moved along the bed methodically, kneeling and rising, her gloves dark with earth, her mind quiet and unhurried. She was working near the far end of the garden, closest to the iron fence, when she became aware that she was not alone on the grounds. She did not hear him at first because he moved quietly, always quietly, and she had been focused on what was in front of her. But some peripheral shift in her awareness made her look up and to her left, through the iron railings of the fence toward the small cemetery plot on the other side. And she saw him. Theodore Weston was on his knees in front of the white headstone. His back was to her at a slight angle, his head bowed, his shoulders dropped in a way she had never once seen them in 9 years of working in his house. He was not composed. He was not measured. He was not any of the things the world knew him to be. He was a father on his knees in the early morning, weeping openly and without restraint, his whole body carrying the weight of something that had clearly never gotten lighter no matter how many mornings he had come to this place and tried to set it down. She did not move. She was not sure she could have if she had tried. She stayed exactly where she was, her hands in the earth, her body very still. And she watched him in the way you watch something that you understand immediately is both deeply private and deeply true. He was speaking too. She could see the slight movement of his shoulders that meant words were being said, even though she could not hear them. And whatever he was saying it with his whole heart, in the way that people speak when there is no audience and no performance and nothing left to manage. She did not look away. Not because she was intruding, or at least that was not how it felt to her in that moment, but because what she was seeing was so purely human, so stripped of everything that usually surrounded this man, that it felt important in a way she could not have explained to anyone. She stayed still, and she witnessed it, and she let it mean what it meant. And when he finally rose, slowly, with the careful movements of a man whose knees had been on cold ground for some time, and straightened himself and stood looking at the headstone for one last quiet moment before turning back toward the house, Loretta lowered her eyes to the garden in front of her and did not look up again until she was certain he was gone. She finished the garden that morning without rushing. She worked her way back along the bed the same way she had come, kneeling and rising, her gloves moving through the soil with the same steady attention she brought to everything. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was still on the other side of that iron fence, still on the image of a man she had worked for 9 years, a man she had watched move through his own house like someone navigating a space that had stopped belonging to him, on his knees in the early morning cold, completely undone in a way that no one who had ever sat across from him in a boardroom or read about him in a business publication would have recognized as the same person. That was the thing that stayed with her most. Not the weeping itself, though that had moved her deeply. It was the difference. The distance between the man the world saw and the man she had just seen through that fence was so vast that it felt like two entirely separate people. And the fact that only one of them was real, only one of them was actually alive and breathing and in pain, made the public version feel like a kind of loss in itself. Like he had been performing himself for so long that the performance had become its own kind of prison. She understood that more than she might have expected to. She had done her own version of it. Not on the same scale, not with the same stakes, but she knew what it felt like to keep a face arranged for the world, while something entirely different was happening underneath it. She had done it through her divorce. She had done it through the years of stretching money further. Then it wanted to go and smiling at her sons and telling them everything was fine and then lying. Awake at night doing the math one more time, hoping the numbers would change. You learn to separate the inside from the outside when the outside is what holds everything together for the people depending on you. She recognized the technique even when it was dressed in a different kind of life. She went inside when she was done, cleaned up, and moved into her regular morning routine. The house was beginning to wake around her. The cook arrived. The other members of the small staff came in through the side entrance and started their respective days. The organized, quiet machinery of the estate began its daily motion, and Loretta moved inside it the way she always did. Directing things here, handling something there, making sure the day's requirements were on track. She said nothing about what she had seen. Not a word. Not a hint. Not even the kind of vague comment that people sometimes make to signal that they are carrying something without actually revealing what it is. She kept it entirely within herself and intended to keep it there indefinitely. It was not her story. It was not her grief. She had witnessed something private, and she would treat it as private, which meant she would treat it as though it had not happened, at least in any outward sense. But inwardly something had shifted. It was subtle, and it was not something she could have pointed to and labeled precisely. It was more like an adjustment in the way she understood the space she worked in and the person at the center of it. She had always done her job well. She had always been thorough and attentive and reliable. But there is a difference between performing a job with professional competence and performing it with genuine understanding of the human being your work is meant to serve. She had been doing the first for 9 years, and she had been good at it. But now she found herself doing something closer to the second, and the difference, though invisible to everyone around her, including Theodore himself, was real. She noticed things she had perhaps registered before, but not acted on. The evenings when he did not come to the kitchen for his usual late meal, which meant he had either forgotten or had lost the appetite for it. And she began quietly leaving something covered and warm on the counter, near where he tended to sit when he did come in. Something small and easy that did not require effort or decision, just there in case he wanted it. He never mentioned it. She never drew attention to it. But the food was always gone by morning, and she counted that as enough. She noticed a light in the hallway that connected his study to the east wing of the house, the one that had a switch he had to go out of his way to reach. And she began making sure it was on in the evenings before she left for the night, because she had observed, without meaning to, that he moved through that part of the house most frequently in the hours when he could not sleep, which appeared to be often. These were not dramatic gestures. They were not the kind of thing that would ever appear in any accounting of what she did for that household. They were simply the small, invisible acts of a person who has looked at another person and decided that they deserve to be seen. Weeks passed in this way. The estate moved through its rhythms. Theodore came and went, traveling for work and returning, conducting the business of his empire with the same steady efficiency that had always defined him, publicly while carrying privately whatever he carried, which she now understood to be enormous and unrelenting and entirely without witness except for those early morning visits to the East grounds that she made sure, from that morning forward, never to be near during the hours she knew he went. She gave him that. She rearranged her own schedule, quietly and without explanation, to ensure that the East Garden work happened at different times. Never before the sun was properly up, never during the window of morning that belonged to him. Nobody noticed the change because nobody was paying the kind of attention she was paying. That was fine. That was exactly how she wanted it. It was on a morning that had started no differently from any other that things shifted in a way neither of them had anticipated. She had come into the kitchen earlier than usual because the cook was unwell and had called ahead, and Loretta was covering the morning setup herself, which she did not mind. She had the coffee going and was working quietly at the counter when she heard his footsteps in the hallway. He came in earlier than his usual time. She registered this without turning around immediately, giving him a moment to settle into the room the way she had learned to do, not making a production of his arrival. She set his coffee down at the end of the counter where he preferred it, and moved to the other side of the kitchen to continue what she was doing. He said, "Good morning." She said it back. This was their usual exchange. No more than that. But this morning, he did not move to the counter and pick up his coffee and stand with it the way he normally did. He stayed near the doorway. She became aware of this without looking directly at him, the way you become aware of a change in a familiar pattern. Then he spoke again, and the words were not the ones that belonged to their usual morning exchange. He said her name, not as a summons, not as the way an employer says a staff member's name when they need something. He said it in the way that people say a name when they are using it to start a sentence they are not sure they are going to finish. She turned from the counter and looked at him properly. He was standing in the doorway of his own kitchen, and he looked for just this one unguarded moment, like a man who had come to the edge of something and was not certain whether to step back or forward. He looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He looked like someone who had been alone with something for so long that the alone itself had become its own kind of weight on top of the original thing. She waited. She did not fill the silence with anything. She simply stood and waited and let him have whatever time he needed to find the words or decide not to. And then he asked her, quietly, almost carefully, as if the question itself was fragile and might not survive being said out loud in the wrong way. He asked her if she had ever lost someone. Not a colleague or an acquaintance. Someone real. Someone who had been at the center of things. She held his gaze for a moment before she answered, because the question was not a small one and it did not deserve a small answer. And then she told him yes. She had. She told him she had, and she meant it, in something in the way she said it. Plainly, and without any attempt to manage it. Made him exhale in a way that sounded less like a breath and more like something he had been holding for a very long time finally being allowed to leave.